Did you get a message saying the recording?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we're ready to start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in either virtually or in person. My name is Annie Evans. I'm with the New American History Project at the University of Richmond here in Virginia. And I'm delighted to be with you today. Today, I'm going to share with you an array of tools and resources that we've been creating at the University of Richmond for K-16 educators to enhance the way we teach and learn history, literature, environmental science, data literacy. And we hope that teachers will embrace these tools and find creative ways to integrate them in cross-curricular ways into the teaching and learning of your disciplines. There's a bit.ly on the screen and also a QR code if you want to capture these slides so that you can use them and refer back to them later. Everything I'm going to show you today is an OER, open educational resource, meaning there's no login, there's no password, and there's no paywall. We give you all of these tools under a Creative Commons license, so you are free to use them in your classroom. The only thing we ask is that you don't monetize them in any way, such as sites like Teachers Pay Teachers. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Here's a little bit of background knowledge about me that you can look at later. But I want to jump right into sharing New American history with you. So this is a screenshot of our main website. Each month we sort of change up the content. We always feature a new learning resource. That's my primary responsibility, is to take all of the tools and resources I'm going to share with you today and mix them into ready to go digital resources that students can work on independently with a partner, in small groups, or whole group instruction. We will feature a different share different tools and resources that are new, or draw your attention to some things out of various archives that we think are relevant. Always trying to keep it fresh. So many of these tools are constantly being added to or enhanced so that you can continue the learning process with your students. Everything is hyperlinked in the presenter notes. This is another tool that we're going to explore in a few moments in a little bit more depth, but this is Bunk. Bunk is a real-time curation of all different forms of media that somehow relates to American history. And what we're trying to do with this tool is show kids how an archive can relate what's happening in the news now to everything that's happened before. So this main page is going to change up every day. We have students at the University of Richmond who are curating new content as we speak. We just hit our 10,000th entry into Bunk last week. And so anytime that you click on a square or search for a piece of content in Bunk, it's going to show you other content that's already ingested into Bunk that is related to that topic, either by the same theme, the same location, the same person. And for example, in the top right corner, I did a search for the name of New Orleans, and it came up with 119 pieces of content that is currently in Bunk for the city of New Orleans. We added a new feature this past fall, which is mapping out the content. So here's all those articles in Bunk kind of mapped out for you geographically, so that students can get an idea of where else are people talking about this topic or this historic event or this historical figure. So we think Bunk is a pretty interesting tool for kids to learn history and see how lots of different content areas and time periods are integrated. You can look at different connections, so kids will be able to explore them by the same ideas, the same people, the same places, and by time period. You can share one connection between two pieces of content, or you can build your own collections or use curated collections that we've put together in the form of exhibit. And we're going to take a look at those in a few minutes. The other big tool that we're going to focus on mainly today is American Panorama. This is a digital atlas. We have been building these maps at the University of Richmond Digital Scholarship Lab for a number of years. Some of them you may recognize. A few of them have been in the news quite a bit in the last few years. Others may be new to you, and we're going to take a look at some of these tools today. We also have an archive of the Backstory podcast. It started off as a radio program, and then later on, as podcasting became more prevalent, we have 13 years of the Backstory podcast, which was hosted by our executive director, historian Ed Ayers, and his colleagues and friends from various colleges across the nation. And this took a different topic each week and then broke it apart through different eras. We have now segmented each of those hour-long episodes into shorter chunks that teachers can embed into their lessons and learning experiences. We have transcripts, so students with hearing impairment that can't listen to the audio content can follow along in the transcripts. Language arts teachers oftentimes will have students listen and follow along with the transcripts, highlighting key vocabulary or annotating the transcript as they listen along. So we try to make this as flexible a tool as possible. This is an archive called the Valley of the Shadow. This is what I like to call version 2.0. This is a Civil War archive. It's by some standards considered the first piece of real humanities digital history projects on the web. So Dr. Ayers, when he was a young professor at UVA, quickly embraced new technologies like Netscape and the internet. And many people said, oh, why are you fooling with that? Nobody's ever going to use that. Well, 30 years later, we are still using that. And we are happy to share with you a new and improved version of the Valley of the Shadow. So if you're studying Civil War history, rather than having students memorize places and names of generals and battles, we think putting the human face on any aspect of teaching history, including the Civil War, is a really engaging way to get students to learn how to use digital archives, compare the past, and also find new and unique ways to look at history. So we've got this divided into 3 eras: before, during, and after the war. And we have digitized public records, images, maps, letters, diaries, newspaper excerpts, and military records. So students can learn one city in the North, one city in the South, what people were thinking and experiencing during this really seminal period of American history. The Future of America's Past is a video series that was hosted on PBS by Dr. Ayers for 2.5 seasons. We have 8 half-hour episodes divided up into smaller chunks with accompanying learning resources. And then we have 2 shorter excerpts that we call pandemic shorts that were made later during the COVID lockdown period. And so they're on a variety of topics. The idea behind the Future of America's Past was to kind of reveal some of those untold stories behind history. So for example, the one you see on your screen looks at the Freedom's Fortress, Fort Monroe, from 1619 to the Civil War contraband decision, all the way up into the modern era, talking about how we preserve historic spaces in the modern era. So we get into a little bit of a civics lesson there towards the end when we talk about historic preservation and the way that public spaces are used. So other episodes focus on school segregation, the Alamo, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So again, a variety of topics, pulling out those themes that may not have been in a traditional history textbook or lesson. Mm-hmm. And that brings us to the learning resources. So I get to mix all of those tools and resources that we just briefly mentioned into ready to go classroom learning resources. And we're going to take a look at the learning resources library towards the end of our presentation today, so you can see how you can search for tools and resources that might be useful in your classroom. So I'm going to go ahead now. I'm going to come out of the presenter mode with the slides. The rest of these slides are mainly here so that you have links to go to later on, but I think it's a lot more engaging for us to go out to the live tools and resources and show you how they're used. So I am going to start with Bunk. As I mentioned, Bunk is, when the first time I met Dr. Ayers, I told him that this kind of reminded me of a Pinterest board, but it changes every day. And so what we do here is we bring together what's happening in the news and relate it to the past. So whatever topic happens to be on the homepage, or if you search for a topic up here under the menu, it will show you different connections. So I'm going to go ahead and select this article on Jewish soldiers. This is Passover at the time when we're filming this meeting. And so this is a very interesting story that talks about during the Civil War era, how Jewish soldiers held their own Seder in the middle of a war zone. And so over here, you'll see that whatever piece of content, sometimes you get an article, sometimes you get a video, a podcast, a digital map, but whatever piece of content you select, on the right, you're going to see what types of historical connections you can make. Do you want to look at things with the same idea, the same people, the same location, or looking at it through various time periods. So as you move through these cards, it's going to show you different connections. You can also explore the different related tags. So you'll see those tags changing. So if you click on one of those tags, it's going to show you other related content. And in some cases, you can actually map that out and see where geographically that content, where that article is located. So that's a little bit about Bunk. If you're a language arts teacher, one feature that people really seem to like is building your own collection. So you can save any piece of content to a collection. You can have students make their own collections if they're allowed to use an email account at school. They can summarize or annotate. If your students aren't allowed by division policy to use an email, you can create a collection as a teacher and push that out to your students. You will get a unique code when you create that collection that you will give to your students, sort of like a Kahoot game. And that way, when they go to turn in their notes, they will put that code in as a way of turning in that assignment. When you've got 2 or 3 pieces of content down here in the right-hand corner, you can view your collection. You can reorder it. Some teachers like to have students put it in order of chronological order from most recent to farther in the past. Others will ask kids, put them in order of what you most agree with to least agree with, and then add a note there and annotate why you made that decision. So there's lots of different ways that you can use the collections. You can name it, you can add a little description, save your changes, and when you go to finalize it, it's going to ask you if you want to make it as a collection that they email you a unique link, or if you set it up as an assignment ahead of time, the kids would put the code in, and that's how they would turn it in. And all the directions on how to make a collection are up here under the menu, or I can zoom in with your colleagues and show you how to create a collection or an assignment, or I can zoom in with your class and teach them how this works. So down here is a little bit of a different set of rules for creating it as an assignment rather than a collection. But those are 2 options that you have for Bunk. So we think that's a pretty interesting tool. And there are lots of maps. All of the maps I'm going to share with you today are integrated into Bunk. So they are tagged, and that way you can use articles and maps and videos and podcasts, and all those get mixed in with that algorithm, and they're constantly being updated. Here's American Panorama. That was a digital atlas that we looked at. I'm going to showcase several of these maps, and we're making new maps all the time. So there's a variety of topics you can use to teach American history or geography or civics or language arts. The first map we're going to look at is a map of forced migration. And so this is a map showing from 1810 to 1850, in the period leading up to the Civil War, migration patterns. Basically, this is where the term we nowadays would call this human trafficking comes from. But the forced migration of enslaved people during the course of the decades leading up to the Civil War are digitized. Over here, you see data in the form of a bubble plot. You see bar graphs. When you first log into these maps, if I were to refresh the map, it's going to show you this powerful hero image where you're going to get a little bit of historical context. Let your students analyze the image. When you enter into it, there's always going to be a how to use this map infographic. Data literacy is a really growing skill that the workforce is asking for. It's going to become more and more important that students know how to analyze data, build skills in data literacy, interpreting maps, graphs, charts, different ways that information is put together. So infographics like this can strengthen their reading skills, their critical thinking skills. We think it's really important to add this feature and have kids take time before they jump right into the map to examine this. Once they've looked at the tools, now when they encounter them and have to start manipulating them, they have a little bit more context. So this is a slider tool. It's like a timeline. You can see the areas in blue are showing what's called the out migration. Where are people leaving? And the areas in this copper, red, orange color are where they're moving towards. So watch how the map is animated as we move closer and closer to the era where the Civil War will begin. More people are leaving the coastal areas. Tobacco is no longer a viable cash crop. So you're pulling in an economics lesson there as well. And talking to students about why were people moving, pushing inland, particularly gravitating towards Louisiana, where most of you who are tuning in are coming from. And looking at that data, you'll see these patterns. But if you remember that infographic, wherever you see an I button, it's going to remind students and add additional content on how they can use each of these tools and pieces of the map, which again, it strengthens their reading skills, their data literacy skills, their math skills. Why teach these things in isolation when you could have several teachers in different content areas teaching these skills using this one terrific resource? So I think that's really important, but we all know that teaching history, it's really important to put the human side to the story and everything we do. So in addition to having data being visualized on the map and looking for patterns on the map, every decade you'll see these bubbles on the map. And when you click on those, it's going to lead you to a powerful narrative story, a diary, a letter, a journal, an oral history, something about these people who were seizing their own freedom or being relocated against their will in bondage over the decades. Some of these narratives will pop up, the same person will pop up in more than one decade. Some of them will only have a single entry. Students can then look into other archives, see if they can find out more information about the people that they read about. In some cases, we have more information. Others, this may be the only entry that was available. So I think this is a really powerful tool, but I also want to show you how the technology is quickly improving and changing. So a map that was made about 4 years after this has similar data, but wow, look at how different that is now. This is a map called Southern Journey. It's presented in the form of what's called a story map. Students can analyze it like a flat map, or they can analyze it in an animated form. So each of these maps is created using a piece of software called a story map. And so as you move through the story map, you can animate the map. This is an overlay showing patterns of Black and white population, with this overlay map layer showing as white settlers were moving in, the expulsion of indigenous people. So this used to be called the Trail of Tears, but really what it is another form of forced migration. So as the map, as you scroll through, you can add other maps in. This is one showing Louisiana sugar parishes. And so talking about how economics was a driving force behind forced migration, behind the enslavement of people. And also you can start to look for these patterns. Where were white settlers moving? Where were African Americans being moved? Some of them free, some of them in bondage. And there's a little bit of historical context for each of these eras. You can compare and contrast this slider tool. These are all things that your students can learn how to use. They can create their own story maps. You can apply for a free story map account for your school or your school division. This is industry level software that most colleges and businesses pay a lot of money to use, but they give it away free to K-12 students, partly because they want to build their future workforce, but also because it's kind of a way for this company to be giving back. But all these different maps that are embedded in here were created using that GIS software. Here's a map of foreign-born population. We have a whole separate map. This is a more updated version, but here's an interactive map showing the same content. This is the map of foreign-born population. I put in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. This is showing me over time. Again, you've got a timeline slider tool here. You've got graphs, you've got data, but this is showing each decade's census data, how we're looking at where are people immigrating into Jefferson County, or excuse me, Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, over time. Where are your largest immigrant populations coming from? So from 1990 up through the last census in 2020, you had a lot of people coming from Honduras, Vietnam, Mexico, and Central America. But if we go back to 1950, no data is available. Think about it. That census is the first one we had after World War II. Let's slide back to 1940. Italy, Germany, France, England. Well, think about it. Italy and Germany were not on our side during World War II. So then look at why were they limiting immigration in 1940s to 50s, right? And so it talks about policy changes where we didn't allow certain people to come into the United States and immigration was curtailed. So that's a whole other conversation you can have with your students. Another really interesting map is Photogrammar. This is a way that you can take images from the Library of Congress. Again, these are all in the public domain, so there's no restrictions on them. You can map out where images were taken from this era by different photographers. You can map it out geographically. I looked for images taken just by Dorothea Lange. She was a famous photographer during that era. I can also zoom in on Louisiana. I can pick a particular place in Louisiana. Here's Orleans Parish, now St. Bernard's. This is going to show me all the images that were taken in that section of New Orleans. You can also look at them thematically. Maybe I only want kids to see images of people working, right? And so then it's going to zoom in even more. And there's only 32 images specifically related to the workforce during the Great Depression in that particular location. Having kids start with their location, whether it be migration patterns, images from a particular time period like the Great Depression, it lets them sort of feel like they're a part of the story. And then as you build out and cast that wider lens from local to state to national to global points of view, they feel a little more connected to the history. If you have civics or government teachers, this is a map showing election patterns. I'm going to go ahead and refresh that so we get that. Again, you start with a powerful image, then you go into this infographic teaching students how to use the tools, and then they go into the map. And I have lost my map. I do not know why that is happening, but of course it's happening because we're recording this, right? I'm going to go ahead and move this out a little bit. Or we will just go on to, let's see if I can refresh it this way. If I pick another map and then hit the back button, that might work. If not, we will move on. Sorry folks for that. We'll move on that one. But this is a map that would show you the voting patterns for the House of Representatives in different voting, for the House of Representatives in different voting eras. So apologies, not quite sure what's going on there, but we will try and work on that and see what's, oh, there it is. Okay. So again, you can move into specific places on the map looking for patterns. This is the Louisiana District 5. I can zoom into Louisiana District 3. You can see voting patterns over long periods of time. Kids can look at, zoom into district patterns, showing in this particular case, this fluctuates between a red and a blue leaning section of the voter. But if you look now, the 2018 election, you've only got one very small section of Louisiana that is blue. You're almost an entirely red state. If you move that back several decades, you used to be an all blue state.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
Talking to students about what those patterns are, what has changed, why have the demographics changed, redistricting, gerrymandering, all of that comes into play. And also those migration patterns, as people move in and out, people's opinions and people lean towards different beliefs. And so these are always fascinating ways to bring civics and government into a geography or history class. The most widely used map by far of all of the maps in American Panorama is this map of redlining. Redlining has become a word that I did not learn in school when I was a student growing up. It's only been in recent years as these maps from the late 1930s to the early to mid 1940s during the New Deal era were rediscovered in the National Archives and digitized by our friends here at the University of Richmond. What they did was they took cities that had 40,000 or more. So I'm going to click on New Orleans. So FDR authorized the Homeowners Loan Corporation to deputize bankers, developers, realtors to go out and score these neighborhoods. They came up with a color-coded system. Green was the best. Blue was still desirable, what we think of as middle class. Yellow was labeled declining. That tended to be high immigrant populations. Red was coded as hazardous. Do not give these people's loans. Do not insure these people's property. And unfortunately, at this time, the biases of the people scoring the neighborhoods, this is the French Quarter that we're looking at now, tended to be divided on racial lines. So Black neighborhoods were predominantly scored red. Immigrant neighborhoods were predominantly scored yellow. White neighborhoods, sometimes they were restricted by restrictive covenants that said only white people could live in those blue and green neighborhoods. And those patterns persist over several decades, far after the Homeowners Loan Corporation was disbanded. So by looking at these maps, students can click on any section of the map. They can see the original primary source documents. They can zoom in and see some of the subjective comments, why people scored certain neighborhoods the way they did. In the learning resources that we prepared for these maps, we do warn teachers in the teacher tips to be very careful when you're using these terms that we would nowadays not find acceptable, such as here where they refer to Negro tenements. We need to prepare students for looking at historical language, oftentimes racially charged language. So it's important that we look at these documents ahead of time before putting them in front of our students, of course. And so that's why we have teacher tips embedded into the learning resources, so that a novice teacher or a teacher who might not be as familiar with the tool kind of knows ahead of time how to prepare their students best to use historic documents.
Mm-hmm.
This is a map of the Homestead Act. And so this again is looking at over time, how land use changed, how ownership of land changed. There's nice introductions so kids can get a little bit of the historical context. What was the Homestead Act? Who could apply for the homestead? We always cite all of our sources. What was indigenous dispossession? Those are kind of some big words that kids might not be familiar with. How was this land acquired? Was it through clashes, massacres, raids, or forcible removal of Indians? So you could use that map that we looked at in Southern Journey, where it showed the Trail of Tears or the displacement of indigenous people. You could use that map along with this one to show those patterns over time, who was applying for patents or land claims as white settlers continued to move across and populate the western parts of the United States. This is a map called Not Even Past, and it compares those original redlining maps, the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps, and sort of a where are they now. So when you look at the original maps, I'm going to zoom in again, it shows you how they were coded in the past. And then if you looked at them under today's, what they call the social vulnerability index, they're looking at health data, income level, how would those neighborhoods be scored today? So up here, we have the original comments that were made on those primary source documents that we looked at on mapping inequality, the ones that were hand typed. And then we're looking at the current state of that same area over here on the right. And this is comparing the public health data that we have for that area nowadays. So you'll notice patterns. People living in consistently red neighborhoods have higher rates of lots of multiple pre-existing health conditions, kidney disease, obesity, diabetes. Sometimes that can be attributed to not being able to grow what they call generational wealth. If you were kept in a low income area, if those restrictive covenants prevented you from purchasing homes in areas where your wealth would have grown over time, then you may not have had the ability to get affordable health care. You may not have had the ability to purchase a vehicle to get to a grocery store. You might be in an area, what they call a food desert, where you only have access to fast food or processed food from places like a dollar store or a convenience store. You're not going to Whole Foods and getting fresh fruits and vegetables. So there's a lot of science, a lot of environmental science, a lot of health science that you can also fold into lessons using these maps and having students compare the past and present. The last map I want to share, this is another story map similar to the one that we looked at, Southern Journey, where you can scroll through, you can embed images, you can embed text, you can embed maps. These are case studies. There's a nice timeline feature that you can build in there, telling students kind of how through each decade, patterns of settlement, public policies, things like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, later on local zoning ordinances. How did all of those things relate to these stories? And then we bring in a little bit of the science aspect of it. We pull in historical images, looking at places in red neighborhoods where very few trees or landscaping compared to a blue or green neighborhood that had lots of parks and shade trees and landscaping. Is going to affect the climate. So kids are really interested nowadays in the environment, the topic of climate change, if we go back and look at these original maps, you can clearly see your green spaces tended to be in the green and blue neighborhoods, and places that were mostly asphalt and concrete now in the modern era are literally sweltering in the summer. Also, we talked about how home ownership was a way to accrue generational wealth in a family. People living in the green neighborhoods see a substantial higher income level and property values as opposed to people living in a red or a yellow neighborhood. So they're learning data, they're learning statistics, they're learning economics, they're learning history. And this is, I love using this image. This is looking at all of the words that were used to describe each of the red, blue, green, and yellow neighborhoods. So you notice the red neighborhoods have words like sewers and odors and treeless, dumps, lowland, and paved, but people living in the suburbs have shade trees and golf club courses and golf clubs and in wooded areas. And so really looking at those economic disparities. So they're still going to get those primary source documents, but they're also going to be able to look at this over time through the environmental lens. What happened to those neighborhoods that those policies impacted them for decades to come? So I think this word cloud is a really powerful image to kind of bring it up into the modern era. So kids can kind of look around their own community. Where are the green spaces? You know, who has parks? When the kids go out for recess, are they on asphalt or are they on grass, right? What do we value in our local communities? Have more modern zoning ordinances and policy decisions tried to improve on these situations, or have we allowed this to continue for decades into the modern era and not gone back and tried to change some of those poor decisions that were made 30, 40, or 50 years ago? So all of these tools and resources, as I mentioned, are available for you and your students. You can create your own lessons, or you can look at some lessons that we've created, kind of blending all of these pieces in for you. So for example, these are the Learning Resources Library. If I search here under any topic, I'm going to come down to redlining, since that's what we were just most recently looking at. These are all learning resources that we have developed to explore this topic. So I'm going to look at redlining and environmental inequalities. The teacher version, as I said before, includes national standards and teacher tips so that you get a little bit of understanding about the different strategies we're using, instructionally, tools that we're using, resources we're pulling from, and any kind of sensitive information that you need to be aware of before you attempt the lesson. The student view does not include any of that. It jumps right into the lesson, so you can plug this one URL into your Google Classroom or your Canvas course or whatever system you use. The kids can look at the vocabulary and then they can jump right into the lesson. It's an inquiry-based lesson. Everything they need to analyze the images, links out to the maps, links out to graphic organizers. It's all already embedded in there for you so that you don't have to hunt for images and make sure that they're in the public domain. You don't have to make your own graphic organizers. We try to make this as easy as possible. We also embedded accessibility tools. So Immersive Reader will read the lesson out loud to students. It comes with a picture dictionary if you have English language learners. So all of these are different features that we thought very intentionally about adding so that most students will be able to access this content. So that's kind of where I'm going to end today. We have a couple of folks with us live. If you put your email in the chat, I will email you a copy of the recording. You can email me at any time. If we click back over here to the slides, on the very last slide is my contact information. I can Zoom into your class and teach a mini lesson with your students for any of these tools or maps or how to use Bunk. I can custom make a presentation for you, or I can just Zoom in and plan with you as a teaching team and help you get ready to use this in any way that's most helpful. So I appreciate your time today. I hope that you got something out of it. I hope that you'll share your feedback with us. And we hope that these tools are useful to you and your students.